It's midnight on January 16th, 1920. In bars across New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and every corner of the United States, thousands of people raise their glasses in a final toast. The lights flicker, jazz plays wistfully, and faces are a mixture of disbelief and defiance. Tomorrow, alcohol will be illegal throughout the nation. The 18th Amendment will go into effect, and with it, the Volstead Act, which prohibits the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. What no one imagines is that this midnight hour marks not the end of drinking in America, but the beginning of the most corrupt, violent, and chaotic era in its modern history. How did the freest country in the world come to prohibit something as old as civilization itself? The answer takes us back decades to a movement that believed it could purify the nation. Mid-19th century America was a drinking country. A lot. The average alcohol consumption per person exceeded 30 liters of distilled spirits per year, not counting beer and wine. In industrial cities, saloons abounded on every corner. They were exclusively male-dominated places where workers spent their wages while their families waited at home. The consequences were visible: domestic violence, poverty, abandoned children. In this context, the temperance movement was born, initially led by Protestant religious groups who saw alcohol as the root of social ills. They did not seek total prohibition at first, only moderation, but with each decade, their message became more radical. In 1874, a group of women in Ohio decided to take direct action. They marched to saloons, knelt on the sidewalks, and prayed for their closure. Some entered and smashed barrels with axes. Thus was born the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which under the leadership of Frances Willard became one of the most powerful women's organizations in the country. Its argument was devastating. Alcohol destroys families, impoverishes homes, and turns husbands into violent tyrants. For these women, who did not yet have the right to vote, the fight against alcohol was also a fight for protection and autonomy. Their influence grew exponentially. In 1893, the Anti-Saloon League emerged, an organization that revolutionized American politics. Unlike previous religious groups, the League operated like a modern political machine. It didn't create its own party, but instead pressured Democrats and Republicans alike. Its tactics were simple and brutal. They supported any candidate who voted for Prohibition, regardless of party, and politically destroyed anyone who opposed it. Wayne Wheeler, its most effective leader, coordinated campaigns across the country. He published lists of whiskey-friendly legislators, organized boycotts, and mobilized religious voters. In state after state, counties began declaring themselves dry through local referendums. By 1910, half of the U.S. population lived in territories where alcohol was prohibited or severely restricted. Entire states like Kansas, Oklahoma, and several in the South had adopted statewide prohibition laws. The movement found unexpected allies: progressives who saw alcohol as a tool of capitalist exploitation, feminists who associated it with patriarchal oppression, and nativists who linked it to German and Irish immigrants. The coalition was strange but powerful. Breweries, primarily of German origin, became the visible enemy of an increasingly xenophobic movement. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Prohibition movement found its final opportunity. Anti-German sentiment soared, and large breweries, with names like Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, and Schlitz, were seen as enemies. The Anti-Saloon League argued that the grain used to produce alcohol should feed the troops. The government needed to conserve resources. Patriotism merged with religious morality. In December of that year, Congress passed the 18th Amendment by overwhelming majorities. By January 1919, 36 states had ratified it, surpassing the three-quarters threshold required. Prohibition was written into the Constitution. On October 28, 1919, Congress passes the Volstead Act over President Woodrow Wilson's veto. This law defines intoxicating beverage: any liquid with more than half a percentage point of alcohol. Beer, wine, liquor, everything is prohibited. Andrew Volstead, a Republican congressman from Minnesota, gives his name to a law that will attempt to enforce the impossible. A mere 1,500 federal agents are assigned to police the entire country. The budget is ridiculous. Loopholes abound, and no one has really thought about how to implement this. But the ink is dry. The law is firm, and the clock is ticking toward midnight on January 16th. In the weeks leading up to the event, the United States prepares for D-Day. Bars organize farewell parties. Some citizens stockpile bottles in basements and closets. Distilleries work at full speed to sell their last inventories. Luxury hotels hide reserves for their wealthiest clients. In churches, pastors celebrate the triumph of morality. In saloons, owners nail boards over their doors. Authorities assure us that the law will be respected. Skeptics laugh. Criminals are already calculating. The clock strikes 12. In Times Square, a crowd rings funeral bells for the death of John Barleycorn, the personification of alcohol. In Chicago, the last drinks are taken amid theatrical tears and nervous laughter. In border towns, eyes are already turning toward Canada and Mexico. The greatest experiment in social engineering in American history has just begun. What follows will transform the country in ways no prohibitionist imagined. Because when you make a criminal out of everyone who wants a beer, you don't create a nation of saints. You create a nation of lawbreakers. On January 17, 1920, the United States wakes up legally dry. Newspapers run triumphant headlines. The reign of tears is over. Religious leaders predict an era of prosperity and family peace. Initial statistics seem to prove them right. Hospitalizations for cirrhosis are declining. Arrests for drunkenness are falling. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. At the ports, bootleggers are already organizing their first routes. In the cities, the first speakeasies are opening their secret doors. At clandestine distilleries, the stills are beginning to boil. And on the streets, a new breed of criminal is awakening. Prohibition didn't eliminate alcohol. It only eliminated the law. And when the law disappears, chaos thrives. What no one knows yet is that in 13 years, Prohibition will create more criminal millionaires than any law in history. It will turn entire cities into battlefields. It will corrupt thousands of police officers, judges, and politicians. And it will prove that there are things no government can prohibit, no matter how hard it tries. The question is no longer whether people will drink. The question is, who will control the business? In the first 6 months of 1920, Prohibition seems to be working. Saloons are closed, the streets appear quieter, and the movement's leaders celebrate. But this calm is superficial. In reality, the country is in a period of adjustment, calculating, observing, searching for the chinks in the armor of the law. And the chinks are enormous. The Volstead Act allows the consumption of alcohol already possessed before Prohibition. It allows sacramental wine for churches and medicinal alcohol with a prescription. It allows the production of grape juice, even if it naturally ferments into alcohol after weeks. These exceptions create immediate opportunities for massive fraud. Pharmacies become the first legal beneficiaries of Prohibition. Doctors can prescribe whiskey for virtually any ailment: insomnia, anxiety, the flu, even old age. Medical prescriptions skyrocket from 100,000 to 10 million in just 1 year. Walgreens, a small chain of 20 pharmacies in 1920, expands to more than 400 stores in 6 years thanks to medicinal alcohol. Patients line up with their prescriptions. Doctors charge for express consultations. And the system becomes a visible farce. But it's completely legal. The government maintains stockpiles of industrial alcohol for use in factories and manufactured goods. Millions of gallons are legally stored. The problem: this alcohol can be redistilled and turned into a beverage. The first bootleggers discover they can steal industrial alcohol, chemically clean it, add flavorings, and sell it as whiskey. But the process is imperfect. The methanol and other poisons remain. In 1920, the first cases of blindness and death from poisoned alcohol begin to appear. The government decides to take drastic measures. It orders stronger poisons to be added to industrial alcohol to make it completely lethal. This decision will kill tens of thousands of Americans over the next decade. On the coast, a new industry flourished: rum running. Boats loaded with Canadian whiskey, Caribbean rum, and European wine positioned themselves just outside U.S. territorial waters, in the area known as Rum Row. Smaller, faster vessels traveled to shore at night, picked up the cargo, and distributed it inland. Bill McCoy, a sea captain, became famous for transporting high-quality, unadulterated alcohol. His reputation gave rise to the expression "the real McCoy." The Coast Guard, with limited resources and slow boats, was unable to stem the constant flow. The beaches along island Florida and California became massive entry points. Canada and Mexico, where alcohol is legal, become the main suppliers. In Detroit, separated from Windsor, Ontario, only by the Detroit River, smuggling is an everyday industry. In winter, when the river freezes, smugglers walk across with cases of whiskey. In summer, they use speedboats. An estimated 3/4 of the illegal alcohol entering the United States comes from Canada. On the southern border, tequila and other spirits flow into Texas, New Mexico, and California. Customs are overwhelmed and frequently bribed. Border guards earn $30 a week. A bribe could be 10 times that. In cities, speakeasies replace saloons. They were clandestine bars that operated behind legitimate facades: laundromats, bookstores, restaurants, private clubs. To enter, you needed to know the password, knock in a certain way, or be recognized by the doorman. The name speakeasy came from speaking softly so as not to alert the police or neighbors. New York had 30,000 speakeasies in 1922, twice as many saloons as existed before Prohibition. They were not exclusively male-dominated places like the old bars. Here, women were welcome, revolutionizing American social life. Prohibition, ironically, freed women to drink publicly. In rural areas, especially in Appalachia, moonshine production exploded. These illegally distilled spirits and homemade stills have a long American tradition, but Prohibition turned them into a mass industry. Rural producers used corn, sugar, and yeast to create whiskey, which they distilled at night, under the light of the moon. Hence the name. Quality varied widely. Some producers were careful craftsmen. Others used toxic materials that poisoned their customers. Junior Johnson, who would later become famous in NASCAR, began his career as a moonshine driver, perfecting driving techniques that would later dominate the racetrack. For the system to work, corruption must be systematic. Speakeasies owners pay local police to ignore their operations. Bootleggers bribe judges to dismiss cases. Politicians receive donations from a nouveau riche of illegal alcohol. In Chicago, an estimated 50% of police officers are on the payroll of bootleggers. In New York, the figure is similar. Federal prohibition agents, poorly paid and poorly trained, are especially vulnerable. Some earn more in monthly bribes than in years of official salary. The American legal system is beginning to rot from within. Among the new moonshine entrepreneurs, one stands out for his audacity and intelligence: George Remus. A Cincinnati lawyer, Remus studies the Volstead Act and discovers its weaknesses. He buys legal distilleries that have permits to store medicinal whiskey. He then hires gangs to steal his own whiskey, which he distributes himself. It's a perfect vertical operation. At his peak, Remus controls 30% of the illegal alcohol in the United States and becomes a millionaire. He organizes legendary parties where he gives away cars as souvenirs. His life inspires the novel The Great Gatsby, but his rise also attracts dangerous attention. Before Prohibition, organized crime in the United States was fragmented and local, small ethnic gangs that controlled gambling, prostitution, and protectionism. Prohibition changes everything. Illegal alcohol requires large-scale production, complex distribution routes, armed protection, and corruption networks. Gangs that can organize and eliminate competition prosper exponentially. In New York, Arnold Rothstein, known for fixing the 1919 World Series, becomes a main financier of bootlegging. In Chicago, Johnny Torrio begins to consolidate operations. In Kansas City, Tom Pendergast controls the city. These men understand that Prohibition isn't just a business. It's a historic opportunity to build criminal empires, and they all need soldiers. Young, violent, ambitious, and unscrupulous men like Alphonse Capone. By 1922, the system is fully established. Alcohol flows freely for those who can afford it. The middle class drinks in speakeasies. The rich drink high-quality imports. The poor drink redistilled industrial poison. The streets are about to become battlefields, and the man who will dominate that war has just arrived in Chicago. His name will become synonymous with Prohibition itself. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1899, the son of Italian immigrants. He dropped out of school in the 6th grade after beating up a teacher. The streets became his education. At 14, he joined a street gang and met Johnny Torrio, who became his mentor. Torrio taught him that true power in crime comes not from impulsive violence, but from organization, bribery, and territorial control. In 1918, Capone was involved in an altercation that left 3 deep scars on his left face, earning him the nickname he would hate for the rest of his life, Scarface. In 1919, Torrio moved to Chicago to work for his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, who controlled prostitution on the South Side. When Prohibition arrived, Torrio saw the potential of illegal alcohol, but Colosimo refused to enter the business, content with his existing operations. In May 1920, Colosimo was murdered in his own restaurant. It was never officially solved, but everyone knew Torrio ordered the murder. Torrio took over and called on Capone, who was 21, to help him build his empire. Capone arrived in Chicago as a nobody. Within 5 years, he was the most famous man in the city. Torrio and Capone organized the alcohol business like a modern corporation. They divided Chicago into territories. They systematically bribed politicians, judges, and police. They controlled distilleries, underground breweries, import routes from Canada, and distribution networks to speakeasies. They also diversified casinos, racetracks, brothels. Everything was integrated. Capone demonstrated a special talent for 2 things: strategic violence and public relations. He ruthlessly eliminated competitors, but he also cultivated his public image. He opened soup kitchens during the Depression, donated to charities, and spoke to reporters, presenting himself as a businessman who simply gave the public what it wanted. In 1924, Chicago's new mayor, William Dever, launches a serious campaign against organized crime. Capone, now the leader after Torrio survives an assassination attempt and retires, decides to move to the suburb of Cicero. In that year's municipal elections, Capone literally hijacks democracy. His men intimidate voters, steal ballot boxes, and beat opposing poll workers. His brother, Frank Capone, is killed in a shootout with police on Election Day. Ultimately, Capone completely controls the government of Cicero. The town becomes his headquarters, where he operates openly without interference. He has his office in the Hawthorne Hotel, where he rules like a medieval king. Capone's main rival in Chicago is George Bugs Moran, who controls the North Side. For years, they wage a bloody turf war. Capone decided to finish Moran off once and for all. On February 14, 1929, Capone's men, some disguised as police officers, lure 7 members of Moran's gang to a garage on North Clark Street with the promise of a shipment of stolen whiskey. The men are lined up against a wall and massacred with Thompson machine guns. Moran, arriving late, escapes minutes later. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocks the nation. Pictures of the riddled bodies appear in every newspaper. Capone is in Florida, asserting his alibi, but everyone knows who ordered the murder. The brutality of the act marks a turning point. The American public is beginning to tire of the violence unleashed by Prohibition. Despite the violence, or perhaps because of it, Capone becomes a celebrity. Newspapers cover his activities as if he were a movie star. He attends sporting events where he receives standing ovations. He sits in the front row at the theater. Tourists visit Cicero, hoping to see him. This fame generates federal resentment. President Herbert Hoover, frustrated by the inability to arrest Capone for his actual crimes, orders federal agencies to hunt him down by any means necessary. The Treasury Department assigns Agent Elliot Ness to lead a special team. Ness and his untouchables, so named because they supposedly cannot be bribed, begin attacking Capone's operations, destroying breweries and distilleries. But the one who finally catches Capone isn't Ness, but an IRS accountant named Frank Wilson. Wilson spends years tracking Capone's finances, looking for evidence of tax evasion. Capone, like many criminals, never filed tax returns despite earning millions. Wilson finds receipts, ledgers, and witnesses who can prove Capone's income. In June 1931, Capone is indicted on tax evasion. At first, Capone isn't worried. He's bought his way off hundreds of charges. But this time is different. The judge replaces the entire jury at the last minute to prevent bribery. Witnesses are protected. The trial is airtight. On October 17, 1931, after a 2-week trial, Alphonse Capone is found guilty of 5 counts of tax evasion. He is sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the harshest sentence ever imposed for that crime up to that time. He must also pay fines and restitution, totaling more than $200,000. Capone, who has bribed, intimidated, and murdered his way to absolute power, is defeated by tax forms. He is sent to Atlanta initially, then transferred to Alcatraz, the maximum security prison on an island in San Francisco Bay, where he cannot exert influence. In prison, the untreated syphilis he has suffered from for years begins to destroy his brain. The man who terrorized Chicago deteriorates mentally. With Capone in prison, his organization fragments. Frank Nitti tries to maintain control, but power is dispersed among several lieutenants. Turf wars resurface. Ironically, just as Capone falls, the entire rationale for his empire is about to disappear. Public opinion against Prohibition has been growing for years. The Depression that began in 1929 left the government desperately in need of tax revenue, which legal alcohol could provide. The same groups that fought for Prohibition lost influence. A new organization, the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, led by wealthy women, advocates for repeal. The experiment was ending. Capone was released in November 1939 after serving 7.5 years. By then, he was a shadow of his former self. The paresis caused by syphilis had destroyed his mind. He retired to his mansion on Palm Island, Florida, where he lived as a mental invalid, cared for by his family. He died on January 25, 1947, at the age of 48, of cardiac arrest related to his illnesses. But his legacy endures. Capone proved that Prohibition, far from eliminating crime, industrialized it. It created the structure of modern organized crime in the United States. And more than anyone else, he personified the hypocrisy of a law that millions violated daily while pretending to respect it. As Capone deteriorates in prison, the United States is about to admit its greatest mistake of the 20th century. Prohibition will be repealed, bars will legally reopen, and the nation will try to forget this nightmare. But the scars will remain. Because when you turn a legal industry into a criminal monopoly, you don't just create millionaire gangsters. You corrupt entire institutions, normalize violence, and teach generations that the law is negotiable. How did this disastrous experiment ultimately end? The answer lies in economics, politics, and a president who understood that some mistakes are only fixed by admitting them. While gangsters like Capone amass fortunes and headlines, thousands of ordinary Americans suffer consequences that rarely make the news. Industrial alcohol, deliberately poisoned by the government to prevent its consumption, kills approximately 10,000 people during Prohibition. On Christmas Day 1926, in New York City alone, 60 people die in 4 days from poisoned whiskey. Hospitals fill with victims of permanent blindness caused by methanol. Doctors are powerless. The federal government, which ordered the poisoning, washes its hands of the matter by arguing that the victims were breaking the law. It is a health scandal hiding behind moral rhetoric. Prohibition not only creates criminals, it creates a culture of corruption that infects every American institution. It is estimated that organized crime paid more than $40 million annually in bribes during the 1920s. Police officers, judges, mayors, governors, and congressmen all pay a price. In Philadelphia, the sheriff is arrested for protecting bootlegging operations. In New York, judges resign amid bribery scandals. In Chicago, it is impossible to obtain convictions against bootleggers because entire juries are bought. The American judicial system, the pride of democracy, becomes a farce. Citizens learn a devastating lesson. The law protects only those who can pay it. The government loses approximately $11 billion in tax revenue during the 13 years of Prohibition, money that previously came from alcohol taxes. Simultaneously, it spends $300 million attempting to enforce the Volstead Act. The math is brutal. The experiment cost more than $11 billion net. This money flows to organized crime instead. It is estimated that in New York alone, speakeasies generate $300 million annually for the mafia. Nationally, the illegal alcohol business was worth more than $3 billion annually at its peak. It is the largest transfer of wealth from the legal to the illegal economy in American history up to that point. The American prison system collapses under Prohibition. In 1920, there were fewer than 3,000 prisoners in federal jails. By 1930, there are more than 12,000, and 30% are incarcerated for Volstead Act violations. The courts are completely clogged. In Manhattan, in 1929, there are more than 7,000 Prohibition cases awaiting trial. Judges can't keep up. Many cases are dismissed for lack of time. Those that do go to trial result in inconsistent and often ridiculous sentences. Housewives are fined for making wine at home. Small-time bootleggers receive years in prison. Meanwhile, big-time operators like Capone walk free for years. The injustice of the system is visible to all. Ironically, Prohibition transformed American culture in ways its proponents never imagined. Speakeasies are not like the old men's saloons. They're integrated spaces where men and women drink together, where blacks and whites mingle in Harlem's jazz clubs, where social classes blur. The jazz age flourished precisely because Prohibition pushed social life into clandestine spaces where the old rules didn't apply. Middle and upper-class women, who previously would never set foot in a saloon, now frequented speakeasies. They smoked cigarettes, drank cocktails, and danced until dawn. Prohibition, designed to restore Victorian morality, accelerated the social liberation of the 1920s. With quality whiskey scarce and expensive, bartenders get creative. Sophisticated cocktails explode in popularity because blends of juices, syrups, and liqueurs mask the awful taste of poorly distilled moonshine. Classics like the Bee's Knees, the Sidecar, and the French 75 are born. Bathtub gins, homemade gins literally made in bathtubs, become ubiquitous. Modern cocktails, which we consider sophisticated today, are born from the need to make the poison of Prohibition drinkable. Bartenders become amateur chemists, experimenting with flavors to hide the kerosene passing for whiskey. In the mountains of Appalachia and the rural South, moonshine bootleggers developed a culture of their own. They needed fast cars and faster drivers to evade federal agents. They modified Model T Fords and other cars, increasing engine power, beefing up suspensions to carry hundreds of pounds of liquor, and perfecting evasive driving techniques. After Prohibition, these drivers sought legal ways to use their skills. In 1948, NASCAR was founded, and many of its early star drivers were former bootleggers. Junior Johnson, considered one of the greatest drivers in NASCAR history, learned his trade hauling moonshine in North Carolina. Prohibition literally gave birth to the most popular sport in the American South. With demand vastly outstripping the supply of real alcohol, an industry of adulteration and counterfeiting flourishes. Criminals learned to convert industrial alcohol into fake whiskey by adding caramel for color, glycerin for texture, and oils for flavor. Fake labels of famous brands are mass-produced. Bottles are refilled with liquids that have never been near Kentucky or Scotland. Some adulterators are careful. Others are criminally negligent. The resulting poison causes not only death but permanent blindness, paralysis, and irreversible brain damage in tens of thousands. The federal government, aware of the problem, refuses to back down, arguing that the victims knew the risks. It is eugenics by omission. The poor who cannot afford quality imported alcohol die or are left incapacitated. On October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed. The country sank into the worst economic depression in its history. By 1932, unemployment reached 25%. Millions lost their savings, their homes, their hope. Against this backdrop of economic despair, Prohibition became unsustainable for entirely practical reasons. The government desperately needed tax revenue. The legal alcohol industry could provide jobs and stimulate the economy. The moral arguments that sustained Prohibition during a decade of prosperity seemed absurd when people were lining up for bread. The national conversation fundamentally changed. By 1930, polls show that a majority of Americans favor repeal. Prohibitionist groups lose influence. Politicians who were once afraid to oppose Prohibition now fear supporting it. Pauline Sabin, a wealthy Republican woman, founded the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, arguing that Prohibition had done exactly the opposite of what it promised: increased crime, corrupted youth, and weakened respect for the law. Her organization grew to more than 1 million members in 2 years. It was women who originally fought for Prohibition, and now it was women who were fighting to end it. The circle closed. The United States is ready to admit its mistake. But repealing a constitutional amendment is not simple. It requires another amendment, approved by 2/3 of Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the states. The political process will be complex, but there is one man who understands a moment, who sees the opportunity, and who has a mandate from the people to act. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he is about to turn the repeal of Prohibition into the first victory of his presidency. The question is not whether Prohibition will end, but what will remain when it finally falls. November 1932. The United States holds a presidential election amid the worst economic crisis in its history. Republican President Herbert Hoover, associated with the economic collapse and the defense of Prohibition, faces the Democratic governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt makes a bold promise. If elected, he will work to repeal the 18th Amendment. He is neither ambiguous nor timid. He calls Prohibition a noble experiment that has failed miserably. His words resonate with millions of Americans tired of hypocrisy, violence, and corruption. On November 5th, Roosevelt wins by a landslide, carrying 42 of 48 states. The message is clear. The United States wants to end Prohibition. Even before Roosevelt took office in March 1933, Congress moved. On February 20th, 1933, both houses passed the 21st Amendment, which would completely repeal the 18th. The process was unusual. Instead of requiring ratification by state legislatures, where prohibitionist groups still held sway, the amendment must be ratified by specially elected state conventions. This allowed voters to choose delegates based specifically on their position on prohibition. It was direct democracy on a single issue. States immediately began organizing their conventions. Roosevelt knows that the ratification process will take months. In the meantime, he wants to give the people something tangible. 11 days after taking office, on March 22, 1933, Roosevelt asks Congress to amend the Volstead Act to allow the sale of beer and wine with up to 3.2% alcohol. Congress passes the law within a week. On April 7, 1933, beer flows legally for the first time in 13 years. Crowds celebrate in the streets. Breweries, which have survived by producing malt, syrup, and non-alcoholic near beer, prepare for mass production. In the first 24 hours, more than 1 million barrels are sold. The relief is palpable. States compete to be the first to ratify the 21st Amendment. Michigan holds a convention on April 10, 1933, and votes to ratify. It is the first. State after state follows. Wisconsin, Rhode Island, New York, all vote overwhelmingly in favor. Anti-prohibition delegates win by margins of 2-1 or more in almost every state. Only the Deep South, where the influence of fundamentalist Baptist churches remains strong, hold out. But even there, the momentum is unstoppable. Each ratification is celebrated with impromptu parties. Radio stations broadcast live counts. The nation watches prohibition crumble state by state. On December 5, 1933, Utah becomes the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, reaching the necessary 3/4 threshold. At 5:32 p.m. Eastern Time, Prohibition officially ends. It is the only amendment in American history to have been completely repealed. Celebrations instantly erupt. In Times Square, crowds scream and dance. Hotels and restaurants that have maintained secret cellars for years open them. The Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan charges 25 cents for an old-fashioned. The Waldorf Astoria offers champagne. Legal bars open their doors. After 13 years, 354 days, 19 hours, and 32 minutes, the experiment is over. Not everyone celebrates. The leaders of the Prohibition movement, who dedicated decades to this cause, are devastated. The once powerful Women's Christian Temperance Union becomes irrelevant almost instantly. The Anti-Saloon League collapses financially. Wayne Wheeler, its most brilliant architect, had died in 1927 without seeing his great achievement destroyed, but his successors witnessed total humiliation. The preachers who proclaimed that Prohibition would save America must admit failure. Some refuse. Several states, especially in the South, maintained state prohibitions for years. Mississippi does not legalize alcohol until 1966, 33 years after national repeal. But at the federal level, the battle is permanently lost. Legal distilleries, many of which survive by producing medicinal or industrial alcohol, are restarting operations at full speed. Seagram, a Canadian company that grew rich supplying bootleggers during Prohibition, is expanding aggressively in the U.S. market. Brands that were forced into exile are returning. New breweries are opening. However, the damage is profound. Before Prohibition, the United States had more than 1,400 breweries. When it ends, only 160 remain. Thousands of wineries have closed permanently. The artisanal knowledge of generations has been lost. It will take decades to recover the diversity and quality that existed before 1920. Repeal eliminates organized crime's primary source of income, but it doesn't destroy it. The criminal structures built during Prohibition merely diversified. Lucky Luciano in New York consolidated control over narcotics, prostitution, gambling, and labor extortion. Meyer Lansky expanded operations into Cuba and developed money laundering networks. New York's 5 families, established during Prohibition, continue to operate to this day. In Chicago, the outfit survives decades after Capone. Prohibition didn't create the American Mafia, but it transformed it from fragmented ethnic operations into a sophisticated national syndicate. That legacy is permanent. The United States learned some lessons from Prohibition, but not all. The repeal set an important precedent. The federal government could admit fundamental mistakes and reverse disastrous policies. But many lessons were quickly forgotten. The idea that vice could be eliminated through moral legislation survives. Decades from now, the United States will launch a war on drugs that almost exactly repeats the mistakes of Prohibition: mass criminalization, disproportionate incarceration, the creation of violent black markets, and systematic corruption. The parallels are obvious to anyone who studies history, but the policies persist. When historians assess Prohibition, the numbers are brutal. At least 10,000 direct deaths from poisoned alcohol, tens of thousands more from bootlegging-related violence, $11 billion in lost tax revenue, $300 million spent on ineffective enforcement, billions transferred to organized crime, institutionalized corruption at all levels of government, the judicial system compromised, respect for the law undermined. And all this for what? Alcohol consumption declined temporarily in the early years, but by the late 1920s, it had returned to near pre-Prohibition levels. The experiment failed on its own terms, but it changed America permanently, in ways we are still processing a century later. Prohibition has officially ended, but its ghosts remain. Criminal structures survive. Cultural attitudes were transformed. Institutions were damaged. And buried in government archives is evidence of an aspect of Prohibition that few know about. The role of federal agencies in enforcing this impossible law, the tactics they used, the men who led the fight, and the battles that never made headlines. The story of those who tried, against all logic, to enforce the impossible. (1920). The 18th Amendment is law, but enforcing Prohibition in a country of 106 million people with 19,000 miles of borders and 30,000 miles of coastline is technically impossible. Congress assigns a job to the Treasury Department and creates the Office of Prohibition. The initial budget is $5 million annually, ridiculously inadequate. 1,500 federal agents are hired to police the entire country. There are no rigorous qualification requirements, no formal training, and the salaries are miserable, between $1,200 and $2,000 annually. Consequently, many agents are incompetent. Some are corrupt from the start, and the few honest ones face an impossible task. Prohibition agents became legendary for their corruption. Between 1920 and 1930, approximately 1 in 12 agents was fired for bribery, extortion, or selling confiscated alcohol. But these were only the cases uncovered. In some cities, agents effectively operated as debt collectors for organized crime, demanding regular payments from speakeasies and illegal distilleries in exchange for protection. Bootleggers quickly learned that a federal agent cost less than a lawyer. An agent's annual salary was approximately $2,000. A successful bootlegger could earn that much in a week. The temptation was immense, and oversight was minimal. In Seattle, a police lieutenant named Roy Olmsted observes the beginning of Prohibition and sees opportunity. With inside knowledge of police operations, Olmsted organizes a smuggling ring from Canada that eventually controls 90% of the illegal alcohol in the Pacific Northwest. But Olmsted has strange principles for a criminal. He refuses to use violence, doesn't sell to minors, and pays his employees fair wages. He becomes a public figure, known as the Good Bootlegger. He even broadcasts a nightly radio show under pseudonym. Federal authorities monitor him for years, using new wiretapping technology, a questionable legal tactic. In 1925, he is arrested. His case reaches the Supreme Court, setting precedents on privacy and surveillance that resonate to this day. In New York, 2 agents become legendary for their theatrical methods. Isidore Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith are an unlikely pair. Izzy is short, chubby, and worked as a postal clerk. Mo is his best friend since childhood. Both are Jewish in an agency dominated by Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But they turn out to be enforcement geniuses. They develop elaborate disguises and personas. They dress as construction workers, salesmen, tourists, musicians. Once, Izzy dresses as a football player, another time as an Orthodox rabbi. They break into speakeasies, order illegal alcohol, reveal their badges, and arrest the owners. In 5 years, they make more than 4,600 arrests and seize $5 million worth of illegal alcohol. They become celebrities, appearing in movies and newspapers. But their success breeds resentment among other agents. In 1925, they are fired without official explanation. The prevailing theory: they shame too many corrupt agents. In Chicago, where Capone operates with complete impunity, the Treasury Department decides to create a special elite team. Elliot Ness, a young agent of 26, is selected to lead it. Ness recruits carefully, looking for agents who cannot be bribed. The team never has more than 15 members, but they are dedicated and, crucially, honest. The press nicknames them the Untouchables. Throughout 1931, they systematically attack Capone's operations, destroying breweries and distilleries. They use axes, dynamite, and armored trucks. In one famous raid, Ness personally drives an armored truck to the entrance of a brewery. The pictures are all over the newspapers. But although Ness damages Capone's operations, he doesn't arrest him. That honor belongs to the IRS accountants. The subsequent myth gives Ness more credit than he deserves, particularly after his exaggerated autobiography is turned into a television series in the 1950s. But his honesty in a corrupt system is real. On the oceans and coasts, the U.S. Coast Guard is fighting a war it cannot win. With old, slow, and few ships, it must intercept hundreds of fast-moving smugglers' boats. Rum runners use speedboats, modified with aircraft engines, that reach 50 knots. The Coast Guard has World War I era destroyers that can reach 20 knots at best. It's like chasing Ferraris with tractors. Regular shootouts occur on the high seas. Between 1920 and 1933, the Coast Guard seized approximately 12,000 vessels and arrested nearly 75,000 people. But these figures represent perhaps 10% of the total smuggling. 90% passes without interference. On the border with Canada and Mexico, federal agents fight daily battles with increasingly well-armed smugglers. The clashes leave people dead on both sides. In Detroit, where cross-river smuggling is a massive industry, there are weekly shootouts. On the southern border, agents are ambushed by smuggling gangs. The work is dangerous, poorly paid, and often pointless. For every smuggler arrested, 5 more wait their turn. Honest agents quickly become disillusioned. Many quit. Others become cynical and accept bribes. Prohibition doesn't just create criminals. It creates a system where being honest is being stupid. Federal courts collapse under the weight of prohibition cases. Prosecutors must decide which cases pursue, because they physically cannot prosecute all of them. They prioritize major figures like Capone, but this means thousands of smaller cases are dismissed. Juries, composed of ordinary citizens who have likely violated the Volstead Act themselves, regularly refuse to convict. The phenomenon of jury nullification, where juries find defendants innocent despite clear evidence because they consider the law unjust, becomes common. Judges publicly express frustration. The judicial system, designed for traditional criminal cases, cannot prosecute mass criminality involving behavior that much of the population does not consider immoral. Not all agents are corrupt or incompetent. Some genuinely believe in the cause and die for it. Between 1920 and 1933, approximately 50 Prohibition agents are killed on duty. Dozens more are seriously wounded. Many of these men are idealists who truly believe they are saving America. Their funerals are public ceremonies where politicians proclaim their heroic sacrifice. But each death underscores the futility of the enterprise. You're not dying to protect the nation from invaders or violent criminals. You're dying because you're trying to keep people from drinking beer. By 1930, even Prohibition's most ardent defenders admit that enforcement has failed. President Hoover commissions the Wickersham Commission to study the system. Its 1931 report is devastating. Enforcement is inadequate. Corruption is rampant. The courts are overcrowded, and public respect for the law has been severely undermined. Ironically, the Commission still recommends continuing prohibition but with better enforcement, a contradiction that no one takes seriously. The reality is clear. You cannot enforce a law that the majority of the population rejects, especially when a violation is private, victimless, and universally accepted. Prohibition did not fail for lack of effort. It failed because the task was impossible from the start. The men and women who attempted to enforce Prohibition fought a losing battle from the start. Some were heroic, others corrupt, most simply overwhelmed. But the real battle of Prohibition wasn't fought in the streets or on the coasts. It was fought in American culture itself, in attitudes toward authority, law, and personal liberty. Prohibition transformed how the United States views itself and what behaviors it considers legitimate for the government to control. Those cultural transformations are perhaps the most lasting legacy of these 13 years. And some of those transformations were liberating in ways the prohibitionists never imagined. On the evening of January 4th, 1922, 6 young women entered the Delmonico, a restaurant in Chicago, asking for a table. They wear short dresses that show their ankles, their hair cut in a modern bob, and carry cigarettes in long holders. They order martinis. The nervous owner serves them. 20 years earlier, this would have been scandalous and impossible. Saloons were strictly off-limits to respectable women. But speakeasies are different. They are illegal by definition, so the old rules of respectability don't apply. Middle and upper-class women discover they can drink, smoke, and socialize publicly without destroying their reputations. Prohibition, designed partly by temperance feminists to protect women, ironically frees them from Victorian restrictions. The 1920s produced a new type of young woman, the flapper. She wore short skirts, danced at Charleston, drove cars, worked outside the home, smoked, drank, and was sexually liberated by the standards of the time. Flappers became symbols of modernity. Magazines simultaneously criticized and celebrated them. Sermons condemned them. Advertisers exploited them. But they represented something real, a generation of women rejecting the restrictions of their mothers. And the speakeasies were their natural habitat. They're away from the respectable public eye. They experimented with identities that would soon become mainstream. Prohibition, attempting to restore the morality of the 19th century, accelerated the arrival of the 20th century. In Harlem, the African-American neighborhood of Manhattan, nightclubs flourished during Prohibition. The Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, and Small's Paradise offered jazz, illegal alcohol, and a racial mix unusual for the era. Black musicians such as Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Cab Calloway became stars. White audiences traveled uptown to hear them. Speakeasies created spaces where racial lines, while not erased, became more porous. A white man and a black man could drink in the same illegal bar, even though they couldn't legally do so in many public places. Prohibition, driven partly by nativist and racist sentiments, ironically created spaces for cultural integration. The Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance are cultural phenomena intertwined with Prohibition. Writers such as Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay document Harlem's nightlife. Poet Count T. Cullen writes of speakeasies where gin-soaked laughter fills the air. Clubs are more than places to drink. They are incubators of artistic innovation. Jazz evolves rapidly under these conditions, fusing African, European, and American influences into something entirely new. By the time Prohibition ended, jazz was the quintessential American music, exported worldwide. The law that attempted to purify America helped create its most vital artistic expression. Prohibition-era films are fascinated with gangsters. Little Caesar in 1930, The Public Enemy in 1931, and Scarface in 1932 simultaneously glamorize and critique the life of crime. Actors like James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson become stars playing charismatic gangsters. These films are morally ambiguous. The criminals are violent and end up dead, but they are also attractive, powerful, and live intense lives. Hollywood recognizes what real America already knows. Prohibition has turned criminals into celebrities and transgression into an aspirational lifestyle. Reformers are horrified, but audiences pack the theaters. Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby in 1925, a novel that perfectly captures the ambiguous morality of the Prohibition era. Gatsby makes his fortune through bootlegging and speculation, but he is presented as a tragic and even noble figure. The parties at his mansion, fueled by illegal champagne, are both glittering and empty. Fitzgerald neither celebrates nor condemns. He documents a society where wealth, regardless of its source, buys respect. Ernest Hemingway, in The Great Gatsby, portrays expats, American settlers in Europe, drinking freely and mocking the Prohibition's hypocrisy of their home country. The literature of the 1920s is drenched in alcohol and cynicism toward moral authority. The generation that reaches adulthood during Prohibition develops a fundamentally different relationship with authority than their parents. They grow up watching respectable citizens break the law daily. They see politicians preach temperance while drinking in private. They see police officers accepting bribes. They see that rules are for those who can't pay them. This generation learned cynicism early. Sociologists of the time document the phenomenon. College students drink more during Prohibition than before. Fraternity parties become legendary for their excess. Young people don't just break the law. They celebrate it as an act of generational rebellion. The so-called lost generation loses faith not only because of World War I, but because of the institutionalized hypocrisy of Prohibition. The 1920s saw the explosion of the automobile as a mass consumption product. The Ford Model T and its successors put vehicles within reach of the middle class. Young people used cars to escape parental supervision, driving to speakeasies in neighboring towns or to the countryside to remote roadhouses where they could drink unseen. The automobile and alcohol became culturally intertwined. Alcohol-related car accidents increased, creating the problem of impaired driving that persists to this day. But the automobile also represented freedom. Freedom to move, to escape, to transgress away from watchful eyes. Prohibition and automobilization combined fundamentally transformed American youth culture. Radio emerged as a mass medium during the 1920s. By 1930, approximately 40% of American households owned radios. Broadcast created a shared national culture for the first time. News of spectacular raids, gangster trials, and Prohibition-related violence became national entertainment. Dramatic programs featured stories of heroic agents fighting bootleggers. Audiences heard jazz broadcasts from nightclubs. Radio made Prohibition and its violation national shared experiences, not just local phenomena. This cultural connectivity reinforced the growing consensus that the law was ridiculous. Perhaps the most profound transformation is psychological. The United States, founded in part by Puritans seeking to impose rigorous moral discipline, reversed its relationship with moral authority during Prohibition. Before, transgression brought shame. During Prohibition, compliance brought shame. Being dry, teetotaler, marked you as old-fashioned, boring, possibly hypocritical. Being wet drinker marks you as modern, sophisticated, honest. The intellectual, artistic, and economic elites are openly wet. Only in rural areas, especially the Protestant South, does the dry sentiment maintain sway. This geographic and cultural divide between urban and rural America, initiated or at least exacerbated by Prohibition, persists to the present. Prohibition attempted to make America more moral, purer, more Christian. Instead, it accelerated its modernization, its secularization, its urbanization. It freed women from Victorian restraints. It democratized once segregated spaces. It created jazz as an art form. It produced enduring literature. And it taught an entire generation to distrust the moral authority of government. When Prohibition ended in December 1933, the country that emerged was culturally unrecognizable from what was in January 1920. But there was another, darker, and more lasting legacy. The structures of organized crime that survived for decades, and the lessons the United States apparently failed to learn about prohibiting behaviors the public considered personal rights. On December 6, 1933, the United States wakes up legally wet for the first time in nearly 14 years. The newly legalized bars are packed, but the transition isn't entirely smooth. Thousands of speakeasies close because they can't quickly obtain legal licenses. Legal alcohol prices are initially high due to a shortage of legitimate production. Cheaper illegal alcohol continues to be sold for months until the legal supply stabilizes. Gangsters don't disappear with decree, but slowly the illegal market shrinks. Ordinary citizens prefer to drink legally. Alcohol-related violence decreases dramatically. By 1935, the experiment is clearly history. Although Prohibition ends, the organized crime it created does not disappear. The five families in New York reorganized in 1931 under the leadership of Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, creating the Commission, a governing council that coordinates criminal operations territorially and minimizes internal wars. They shift their focus from alcohol to narcotics, illegal gambling, labor extortion, loan sharking, and eventually the control of labor unions and the infiltration of legitimate businesses. In Chicago, Capone's outfit continues to operate under new leaders. The corporate structure developed to distribute illegal alcohol is perfectly suited to other criminal enterprises. Prohibition did not create the mafia, but it transformed it into an enduring national institution. Some fortunes built during Prohibition become respectable afterward. Joseph Kennedy, father of future President John F. Kennedy, is rumored to have made part of his fortune by illegally importing whiskey, although this is never definitively proven. What is known is that Kennedy obtained exclusive import rights for British brands just before the end of Prohibition, positioning himself perfectly to capitalize on the relegalization. Samuel Bronfman, whose family controlled Seagram in Canada and massively supplied American bootleggers, turned his company into a completely legitimate global alcohol empire. By the 1950s, Seagram was one of the largest beverage companies in the world. Prohibition money, laundered by time, became respectable dynasties. American institutions take decades to recover from Prohibition. Public confidence in government, damaged by 13 years of visible corruption, official hypocrisy, and selective enforcement, remains low. The FBI, formally established in 1935 under J. Edgar Hoover, is built partly as a response to the failure of Prohibition agencies, with higher standards and better training. But Hoover himself learns the wrong lessons. He believes the failure was one of will, not concept, and spends decades denying the existence of organized crime until the evidence is undeniable. The cynicism toward the law, cultivated during Prohibition, becomes a permanent part of the American attitude. Although the 21st Amendment repeals national prohibition, it allows individual states to maintain their own prohibitions. Several southern states remain legally dry for decades. Oklahoma didn't fully legalize alcohol until 1959. Mississippi maintained statewide prohibition until 1966, 33 years after the national repeal. Kansas only allowed the sale of distilled spirits by the glass in 1987. To this day, in the 21st century, dry counties exist in several states, mostly in the South, where alcohol cannot be legally sold. The moral geography of Prohibition survives in these spaces, small monuments to a cultural battle the nation has largely chosen to forget. In June 1971, President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse to be America's public enemy number one, officially launching what would become known as the War on Drugs. The similarities of Prohibition are obvious to historians but ignored by politicians. Criminalization of substances consumed by millions, mass incarceration, creation of lucrative black markets, violence between cartels vying for turf, corruption of law enforcement agencies, massive government spending with minimal results. 50 years later, the United States incarcerates more people for drugs than any nation in the world. The cartels are more powerful than ever, and drug use has not significantly declined. The lessons of Prohibition, it seems, must be relearned every generation. Prohibition devastated American craft knowledge of alcohol production. 1,400 breweries before 1920, 160 after. Thousands of distillers, vintners, and brewmasters lost their trades or died without passing on their knowledge. The consolidation that followed the repeal meant that a few large companies dominated the market with standardized products of mediocre quality. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that the craft beer movement began to regain diversity. By the 2000s, boutique distilleries and small wineries were resurfacing. It took nearly 60 years to rebuild what Prohibition destroyed in 13. That lost knowledge represents an incalculable cultural cost. The 21st Amendment set an important precedent. The Constitution can correct itself. It is the only time one amendment completely repeals another. This reinforces the idea that the Constitution is a living document, not an immutable sacred text. The process of ratification by state conventions, used for the 21st, demonstrated that constitutional changes can reflect direct popular will, not just a consensus of legislatures. However, the process has never been repeated. Each subsequent amendment has been ratified by state legislatures. Prohibition remains a unique experiment in its creation and destruction. In American popular culture, Prohibition is remembered romantically. Films, television series, and novels portray the 1920s as an era of glamour, jazz, and charismatic gangsters. Modern speakeasies, themed bars that recreate the underground atmosphere, proliferate in American cities. The real violence, the deaths from poison alcohol, the systemic corruption, and the suffering caused are downplayed or forgotten. This selective memory is convenient. It allows the United States to celebrate the culture of the 1920s while confronting the disastrous policies that shaped it. It is nostalgia for an era that no one who actually lived through it would want to repeat. In the end, Prohibition raises questions that the United States has yet to fully answer. What personal behaviors can the government legitimately regulate? Where is the line between protecting public health and individual liberty? Can legislation fundamentally change human nature? When is it acceptable for majorities to impose their morality on minorities? Prohibition suggested answers. Government cannot effectively prohibit widely practiced behaviors without direct victims. Legislative moralization creates more problems than it solves. And when the law diverges too far from social practice, it is a law that loses legitimacy, not the practice. But these lessons, clear in retrospect, are easy to forget when a new moral crusade captures the political imagination. On January 16, 1920, the United States attempted to legislate virtue. It believed it could eliminate alcoholism, domestic violence, and poverty by prohibiting alcohol. Instead, it created a multi-billion-dollar black market, empowered organized crime, corrupted its institutions, killed thousands with poison alcohol, and taught a generation to despise the law. On December 5, 1933, it admitted its mistake, but the experiment left permanent scars. Prohibition demonstrated that a democracy can make massive mistakes even with the best intentions, that the moral consensus of one generation can be the shame of the next, that prohibiting what people want doesn't eliminate desire. It only pushes it into the shadows where crime flourishes, and that the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies can be worse than the original problems. 100 years later, the United States is still grappling with these lessons. It's still debating which substances to ban and which to legalize. It's still imprisoning millions for victimless behavior. It's still funding criminal cartels with its own prohibitions. Alcohol prohibition ended, but the prohibitionist mentality lives on. Perhaps the most important legacy of those 13 years is this: the demonstration that the American government can be profoundly, disastrously wrong, and that when it is citizens, millions of them acting individually, can simply refuse to obey until reality forces change. Prohibition wasn't a parenthesis in American history. It was a transformation. The country that emerged in December 1933 was more cynical, more urban, more secular, more integrated, and more aware of the limits of government power. These weren't necessarily bad changes, but they were permanent. And that's perhaps the ultimate irony. The experiment designed to restore 19th century America accelerated the arrival of 20th century America. The prohibitionists wanted to preserve their world. Instead, they destroyed it faster than any economic or cultural force could have done alone. Prohibition ended. Its ghost never did.